Glasses up. Cheers. Hey everybody, Merry Christmas. Wow, we have a lot to talk about. I'm just going to get right into it. We're drinking 7-7. If you're from 1980s, and born in that era, you may have seen this cocktail. It's not popular these days. You still find it. 7-Up, Secret 7. Great stuff.
It's not popular these days.
No, the trendy drink now is highball, ginger ale, and gin.
Mm-hmm.
It's rye. It's either gin or rye whiskey.
Gotta get
That's
the rye.
it. The rye whiskey.
The
That's
hipsters like the rye.
I thought highball was any drink that you drank in the highball class or in the afternoon.
No.
Alright. If I'm right, leave it in the comments.
Leave in the comments on what type of highballs you prefer.
Exactly.
That didn't sound right. Today we're reviewing a book that will be a major motion picture in just a few days here called Unbroken. There is so much in this book. It spans the life of one man, Zamperini, from basically his, being born all the way through. He was well into his 90s. Spoiler alert,
early 90s.
He does live. We'll save some of that. He was an Olympic athlete. He was a war hero. He was in several Japanese concentration camps, or whatever their equivalent of that is called.
POW camps.
POW camps, yeah. It's really hard to just kind of pinpoint an area of this book to talk about. We'll give you just a brief summary. He grew up in Torrance, California, which is really close to where we film.
Right.
Within 30, 40 minutes. Ran in the Olympics in 38.
Mm-hmm.
As a 19-year-old kid.
Right.
Crazy,
You
yeah.
don't tell him what kind of Olympic career he might have had if not
Right.
for World War
He was
II.
close to breaking being the first man to get the 4-minute mile. He was close to that.
He was, a couple seconds away from that.
Right.
And kind of had a rough Scrabble upbringing, a troublemaker. Joined the military. The Air Force was not yet around, so it was part of the Army. Army Air Corps. And did some pretty intense missions, very close to dying in several of them. And then one day, his plane is shot up, makes it back, very rough night, bombing, attacks, all that stuff. And then he basically gets what's the officer, what was his title? Someone that was senior to him asked him to go on this search party, right?
He was their wing commander or the...
Was he I thought he was just like some random first lieutenant.
I don't know the Army Air Corps ranks, but he was like a first lieutenant.
But you guys are military. He was asked to do this in a...
He was volunteered.
Yeah, you're not really... He didn't volunteer, but was told you're going to volunteer, right? How does this work?
This was the same officer who wanted them to fly on 3 engines, and they said, "Oh, absolutely, we'll do that if you'll come up with us in the plane." And then he canceled it. No, there's a lot of, especially second lieutenants and first lieutenants who just don't know what the hell's going on. But if they give you a direct order, you can say, "Sir, that's a stupid idea." Right. But if they give you a direct order, you're going to do it, even if you think they're an idiot. Right. And so he sent them out on this mission with a real shitty plane that everybody knew wasn't going to fly, and it was just a stupid idea, but it was an order, and that's part of the oath, is to follow the orders of the officers appointed over you.
Right. He was voluntold. That's what
voluntold.
They called it. Yeah. And the thing is like when you're an enlisted man like us, at least we have that buffer of the first sergeant and those in between it, but being that he was an officer, he had to directly listen to this guy's mouth. This guy who had no piloting experience and really didn't know what was going on, but he just do what I say.
It was what they asked him to do to kind of put this in perspective. They were going to look for a plane that had been basically missing. It didn't have a lot of confirmation, a lot of details. The technology back then, near the end of the war, they had some radio beacons where they could kind of find out maybe where a plane had gone down, but it was more or less, here's where they left from, here's where they're going. They probably went down somewhere in the middle, provided they stayed on course, which, there's no GPS, it was line of sight, it was a couple of charts and this and that, and so they went to go find this plane. Their plane had some mechanical failures, kind of this catastrophe of all these things going wrong, and ends up going down, and there's a very unique, we read about this in that Sinking of the Bounty we talked about, where these people had these near-death experiences of being pulled underwater. And he talks about how he's wrapped up. In each plane there's miles of cable, and he's tied up in this cable and somehow manages to bob to the surface and get out, and doesn't really know how he got there.
And that's never explained. Yeah, he says he came out. he called it spaghetti. It was wrapped up in the wires.
The wiring for the plane.
Yeah, the spaghetti he called it, and somehow he blacked out, and then he came up to the surface.
Right.
He doesn't know how.
He was able to, and at that point he was able to inflate his life jacket and, you know, get out of the plane safely. But that's one of those things that I think you can attribute to, in my beliefs, a higher power or reasoning for you to keep existing. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. There's not a logical explanation of how this happened.
Right.
It's probably more mystery of this plane went down, the odds of these guys living. I mean, there's some stats in this book of people that died just from training and crashes in
Right.
the ocean that were not at all related to combat was astronomical. I mean,
Right, exactly.
Yeah, several of them survived the crash, and some died like right there after the crash. But 3 of them survived much longer, and only 2 made it.
They say even by the end of the war, when they had more like the homing beacons and all that kind of stuff, that their survival rate was only like 40-something% that they would even find you, or like
Yeah.
wreckage of the
It was
plane or
something
something like
crazy
that. It was
like
just
that,
like
yeah.
extremely low chance of survival if you had to ditch an aircraft over the ocean.
So one of the things I found very intriguing was that they were adrift at sea for 47 days until they came to land, which is 6.5 weeks.
Right.
And as they neared the end, starving, dehydrated, I think talk about like the flesh had basically evaporated. It was like translucent on their skin, and they were down to like between 60 and 80 pounds. But their mental acuity, their minds were really, really sharp.
Right.
And they weren't hallucinating. They were remembering things from early in their childhood, from when they were tiny babies.
Right.
And something about the mind, they didn't go insane. They actually had an elevated functioning in their brains, which I thought was
Right.
very intriguing, really amazing.
You know, it goes to, they talked about how, Hillenbrand talks about how, you know, he got to the point where, you know, there was no stimulation at all.
Yeah, it's
There
floating
was just-
lifelessly
it
in
was
the
just-
boat.
Yeah, it was just ocean, sky, there was no sound, no smells, no anything. And one day he decides to dig in his ear and he smells the wax
It's
on his
gross.
finger. As gross as it is, that difference
Yeah,
of a different sensation.
Okay,
Just,
so you have to, he digs in his ears, gets some wax, and smells it. Oh, that's interesting. It's more different than
Well,
anything
you know
else
what?
out here. And so him and his boatmate Phil, is it? Yeah, Phil.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so they both make this habit of like digging in the ears, like, oh, that's cool. That's cool.
right. Well, it broke the monotony of
Yeah.
what was going on. You know, I mean, that was like the greatest thing for them at that point. You know, and one of the greatest stories I think was the story of Mac, the guy they were the one that ate the chocolate rations on the first day after the plane
Yeah,
crashed.
first day, he just like in the middle of the night,
Right.
like eats all the chocolate while everybody else is
Just
sleeping.
sleep.
Basically, a week plus worth of rations. One guy ate everything.
And the next morning they go and look at it, and they look at him, and he like sheepishly, like very ashamedly, he looks down,
Right.
and he ate everybody's food in one day.
Right, but
One night.
Right, one night. But I think the thing is that the story of his demise, it's heartbreaking. You know, even though Zamperini held it against him in the beginning, in the end he was kind of like, you know, it didn't matter anymore. You know, the guy did it, whatever it was, and just his.
He kind of redeemed himself in the end with some,
Yeah,
some
he
heroic
redeemed-
action.
Yeah, exactly.
And he died right after.
Right. So he had expended his last little bit of energy trying to help them to survive, and then
Yeah.
you know he has that last gasp in the middle of the
And
night.
just before the end, he asks
Right.
Zamperini, "Am I going to die?" And when I read that, I thought, what's he going to say? Is he going to tell him the truth? Because I figured, no, buddy, you're going to make it. But he says he didn't have the heart to lie to him.
Right.
So he said, yes, you're
Right.
probably going to die tonight.
And yeah, he just
And he does.
yeah he does. And you know, one of the things that caught me is how the sharks have been following the whole time. but when he puts Mac's body out to sea, they just swim around it and leave it alone. It's like, just this, I don't know what it was, but that was just really kind of poetic in a sense,
Yeah, I thought about it because, I don't know if you guys have ever seen somebody die, but at the very, very end, there's something called agonal breathing, where they're like in agony, it's like,
Right.
and then you don't hear a breath for a long time, and he talked about that.
Right.
And I remember, that's what people look like at the very, very end.
Right. I usually come across people after the fact.
Mm.
But yeah, there was no agonal breathing. It was all over.
What happened? For another video.
Another video. We'll go through some zombie stories. You know what's kind of interesting about all this is this was not, you watch some of the survival shows. This is very primitive in terms of what they have now. This was an open top raft it was all the things that basically could have gone wrong went wrong. They didn't have food. They didn't have water. They make these things, even back then, these old, they call them like solar stills, but they're these little
desalinization
yeah,
kits.
so you can take ocean water and it'll make regular water. It's not a lot, but it's enough to
The
keep
Delano desalinization kits.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was called.
Yeah, and you just basically put them out, and they work with the sun to separate the salt from the water. And
Didn't we read another book about that?
Was that mentioned in the Bounty?
It might have been the sinking of the Bounty.
It was the sinking of the Bounty.
Yeah. So there's ways to do that, and you can kind of survive. But they didn't have, they didn't even have shade, and they couldn't go in the water because the sharks were so bad. They're literally have a very close encounter with the great white. They glimpsed death so many times just outside of the things you'd expect, like starvation and dying of thirst. There was all these close encounters, and after all that, their redemption was the Japanese. And I felt when I read how they survived for 46 days, on just barely clinging to life, I thought, oh my gosh, they're coming into the Japanese. And for those of you who maybe don't know, the Germans have a very rough rap. Everybody knows the concentration camps, the Jews. That's a story we've all heard 1,000 times. But the Japanese part kind of gets left out into what they did. During the war, they were horrible, awful people. This is a broad generalization. But as their culture and what they did in terms of taking over was awful.
Yeah, so I didn't quite, I had seen To End All Wars, and I had heard a little bit about that. I thought those were more isolated incidents that happened in times of war. I didn't quite understand the institutionalized viciousness and brutality of the Japanese military until I read this book and I realized, wow, okay, pre-World War II, Japan was a very, very different place.
It definitely was. They were trying to become industrialized with the West. As a matter of fact, they had made a lot of strides. A lot of people don't realize some of the companies today, like Nissan, was Datsun back then, Mitsubishi, they had all been in business back there since the end of World War I, before pre-war Japan. And, it wasn't until like the rise of the military society that the whole idea of viciousness towards your enemies and that kind of thing, came to a head. And it was because
there was also a hugely racist component to it that, very much like the Nazis, they believed that their race was superior to everybody else. They believed in eugenics, and they believed that they were there to subjugate and kill all the inferior races.
Well, I think theirs came from more or less because they were a homogenous society for such a long time. And, whereas Europe, they had known and been involved with the Mediterranean, Middle East, Asia for centuries. And, they were aware of these other people around them and their cultures and their differences, and even some people embraced that kind of thing. But in Japan, I think it was more or less just because they were homogenous until, Commodore Perry showed up at the later half of the 19th century, and then they were like, oh, white people. That kind of thing. And then once
But whether it's through isolation or through isolation in the case of Japan or through exposure in the case of Germany, it's still a warning, I think, against you know, a lot of these racist ideas about eugenics and racism.
Well, I think the idea is just the whole fascist way of thinking, you know, is...
What is fascism? I mean, I know Obama's a fascist.
Oh,
but
stop it now. What are you talking about?
I saw it on Fox News.
You know what? Don't turn the TV off. As a matter of fact, Dish Network is their contract expired with Fox, which is good. So people like you don't have to think too hard. Do not, man. Oh, wow. Okay. So what else is going on?
So to put it, I mean, I want to put this in perspective because when we hear World War II, we mostly think of the evil Nazis, right? That's what comes to mind. The big swastika, these big, you know, goose stepping and all that stuff. Right. And the Japanese were probably on the same scale, if not worse. I mean, that's right. And no one really realizes that kind of in the scope of modern common history. So when he got taken to these POW camps, the conditions were the same kind of things you'd see in those, you know, World War II documentaries that have been going around looking at these Jewish camps. It was not terribly different. A lot of it was forced labor, not enough food, just horrible acts of torture and awful things. I mean, there was so many awful stories, and was there one that stood out to you guys of the hardness that they had to endure while they cover maybe 3 or 4 different camps throughout the book. I remember one where they kind of picked on Zamperini quite a bit, especially this guy named Watanabe. They called him the Bird, mainly because he's an Olympic athlete, American hero. It was easy to kind of suss him out amongst all these other guys. And they would do stuff to him and other people where they'd basically say, hold a push-up position over the shit trough in the latrine.
Right.
And if you didn't hold, you know, locked out position, if your arms get tired, you would fall in this trough of poop. And it's not like you could just go hose off or get another set of clothes. They weren't even really permitted to bathe. They didn't have enough clean water to even drink. I mean, all these guys were dysentery, under 100 pounds for most of these guys that were, you know, upwards of 5.5 to 6 feet tall.
They ended up getting dengue, beriberi, diseases that were easily treatable.
With just kind of stuff that if you ate a moderately balanced diet would cure most of what these guys got.
Right. The worst, I think, example that they presented in, I keep saying the name, Laura Hillenbrand presented in the book was when they were experimenting on the front porch where they were injecting them with that mystery greenish liquid, and
at the end they inject them with a whole pint of it.
A whole pint of it, and it's, you know, they're hallucinating, they, you know, extreme pain, burning, rashes, the whole thing. And like by the time they got to a pint, it took them a whole week to come down off those conditions. You know, and they were just very sterile in dealing with them. You know, the Japanese doctors. So, what does this feel like?
Yeah.
This is in front of an audience too. It wasn't
right. You know, it was like in some surgical theater. You know, that kind of thing. So that, to me, that's a horrible thing to have to deal with.
There's a couple of bright spots in the midst of. I mean, it's a lot of stories like that. These guys getting the hell beat out of them on kind of a daily occurrence, several times a day. A couple of bright spots that stood out to me. There was one where they talked about all the efforts these guys would take to hamper what the Japanese were doing. So they'd be sent on these work details, and some of them would be like, go unload ships that are coming into the harbor, unload the stuff. And these guys would like make it a point to steal anything they could, and they had this like thieving university where they would train other guys how to steal. And if they got caught, they'd catch a beating, but they'd say like, well, you're losing that job, we'll put new people in. So then it was like, we're going to train the new guys on how to steal.
Well, you know, I think the coldest thing about the University of Thievery was that if you were no good at stealing, when they asked the commander of the prisoners or whoever it was who was in charge of the other POWs who needed to get transferred out, the people who couldn't steal got transferred to like crappier prisons. I was like, man, that's cold-blooded. But, you know, for them that was a matter of survival. And, you know, it's interesting how a sock full of sugar can make you king of the camp, because that became like the gold standard.
Yeah, well, not just a survival, but I think it was a lot of, if we can break all this equipment that's being sent out or sink the ship that they did on a couple occasions, that was a huge psychological win, because they could not physically fight these guards. I mean, you can't really put it into perspective, but they were getting the hell beat out of them literally every day. And if we can destroy a handful of equipment, that's one win for us.
Right.
So this is what we can still do. And kind of a tip of the cap, they were still fighting the war, you know,
from
the inside, doing what they could.
Right, right. You know, and the funny thing, it's not funny, but one of the things I got from it, it reminded me of Hogan's Heroes. You know, when you get down to when he was at the Better POW camp, how you had the Australians and the English, and they all had these plans, and they would dig out of their cells and then dig their way back in, so, you know, other prisoners wouldn't be punished for their absence, and how they just came across helping each other, you know, that kind of thing. And that, you know, that's one of the things that came to my mind when I was reading that part.
Yeah, it was this book is probably a third of the book's on their time at sea, a third of it's in the camps, and then kind of the last little bit is his life outside of the camps. And he was tormented by one guard in particular, just kind of on the daily occurrence, and it really had a lasting impact. You know, even this book talks about after the war, even though these guys survived, the mental trauma that they had to endure, you know, a lot of them became alcoholics, just did not, even though they were, you know, the war had ended, the war had not ended for them. They were still not sleeping.
But I think that's always been a reality of war.
Yeah.
But it's mostly been, covered up. I think now America's coming to grips with the toll the war takes on soldiers. But back then, you know, I think a lot of it was covered up. You know, like Audie Murphy, the highest decorated soldier in World War II, drank a lot, you know, in response to his PTSD, and was just haunted for the rest of his life. But America didn't want to hear that story. They didn't want to hear what the horrors of war had done to him. And I think maybe now, I don't know, but maybe now America's ready to hear about what war does to soldiers. I mean, more soldiers have committed suicide that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan than were actually killed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not that anything's changed. It was the same in World War II, but people just didn't want to deal with that reality of how badly war messes you up. And it really broke my heart, because Zamperini, you know, at 19 he could have been the greatest runner in history. It was amazing. And basically war ravaged his life, and he never got his life back.
Right. Well, I mean, towards the end, you know, he turned himself around and everything, worked it out so for him. But I think that the difference between this generation, like they call World War II the greatest generation, and I think the reason they call it that is because they were used to sacrifice, and there wasn't something that I hadn't realized until a couple of years ago, was that all of these World War II vets were also the people who were children during the Depression. Their entire lives were based around just economic deprivation. They didn't have a lot when they were sent to war. The people that were left behind, I mean, more than half of the American males were gone. And it was, income tax had skyrocketed to 92%. You had to ration food, gasoline, nylons, aluminum, things like that we take for granted today. So for them, I think their whole perception of how to deal with things was a lot different than how we see it today. And I think it goes back to how we were talking about, like, my grandfather and your grandfather being in the war. How they dealt with it, they just don't talk about it. Whereas Audie Murphy was doing movies, always being interviewed, that kind of thing. He had to relive it on a daily basis. You know what I mean?
So here's the thing about the Greatest Generation. That's bullshit.
Oh, here we go.
So we have 1 minute. So
okay, so here goes 1 minute. Okay, so the Greatest Generation is supposedly, they did everything that was good for America, and the baby boomers, they just fucked it all up. But the parents of the baby boomers, I've had a lot of Seagrams now, 77, were the Greatest Generation. So they weren't so great if they couldn't raise their children in such a way to perpetuate a great society. They are the parents of the people who fucked up America.
Well, hang on,
that's a different story.
We're almost out of time. I would say this is probably one of the best books we've read this year.
Oh yeah, we read this book. Yeah.
Well written, great story. This is literally showing what the human soul can endure. If you only read one book in 2015, make sure it's this book. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great